The story of man is a story of change. From his earliest beginnings through each successive age, these changes came about slowly, through thousands of years. Because early man could not write, archaeologists have had to put together that story as it is revealed by the tools, weapons, and other artifacts which prehistoric man left behind. Archaeologists believe that man's antecedents go back over 600,000 years. Little is known of that remote time. However, from unearthed artifacts, greater insight has been gained in the way man lived in epochs closer to our own. From caves in southern France, archaeologists have been able to learn about Cro-Magnon man, who lived over 25,000 years ago. And from Scandinavia, they have learned something about man's life in later periods. The coasts of Denmark are especially rich in ancient trash heaps called kitchen middens. From these piles of refuse have come many artifacts, which, together with drawings made by ancient man on walls of stone, permit us to gain some knowledge of how man probably lived in northern Europe over 10,000 years ago, and how he moved from an age in which all of his tools and weapons were made of bone or stone to one when they were made of metal. At one time, great glaciers covered much of northern Europe. Over thousands of years, the sheets of ice advanced and retreated, and into the newly opened tundra region moved both animals and the men who hunted them. For man was primarily a hunter. For him, the reindeer provided the difference between life and death. With a stone knife, he removed the hide, from which he made his clothing. Once the hide had been scraped clean, it could also be used to provide him with a sturdy tent. Most important, from the reindeer came food. Because he had to go where the animal, man and his family were nomads, ever on the move. Even the bones of the reindeer had their use. They could be turned into harpoons for spearfishing. With the antler, a cutting tool could be made. For his other tools, man relied on the flint he found strewn on the rocky beaches. By breaking the flint he found, he could achieve a sharp cutting edge. He could fashion the arrowheads he needed to hunt. About 10,000 years ago, the glaciers retreated entirely from the face of northern Europe, leaving a new temperate area. Gone were the reindeer, which had moved northward toward a colder climate. Those people who remained in the new, milder region had to find other basic sources of food, for now the rewards of the hunt were not as plentiful. In addition to the old way of catching fish by spearing them, man devised an even more productive method. All he needed was a hollowed-out log. Now he didn't have to wait for fish to come to him. He could paddle in this, his first boat, to where they were. Instead of a spear, he used a fish hook and bait. By adding a handle to his flint, he found he had a greatly improved tool. For countless ages, man had fed off the fruit and seeds of trees and plants. But not until about 4,500 years ago did man in northern Europe discover that by digging up the land and casting seeds onto it, he would have a crop, a harvest he could gather and store to provide him with food for the months ahead. He also learned how to make pots out of clay. Once hardened, they could be used to cook and store food. He learned to beautify these vessels by cutting designs into them. In order to make way for his new fields of wheat and barley, he had to clear whole forests. Trees had to be felled. To help clear the land, he cut the branches off the fallen trees and set fire to the entire area, thereby adding to the fertility of the land. In becoming a farmer, raising his crops and herds, man made one of the most significant advances in his entire development, bringing into being a period we call the New Stone Age. No longer was he a nomad. Now he and his family lived with other families, all part of the same gens or clan. Now his home was built to last. Wealth was measured in flint, for not only could it be used for tools and weapons, it also was an article of trade with those regions along the Baltic coast where flint was scarce. But man knew of the dangers. He believed the gods who gave could as easily take away. Man had to be wary of his gods, the gods of the lake, the rocks, the forest. To appease his gods, man believed he had to make sacrifice. Valuable flint in payment of trees that had been felled. Food to keep fields fertile. The woman who prayed for a husband who would be a good provider sacrificed her necklace of amber. Because it was believed that even in death, man had to fend for himself, whether buried beneath dolmens or within megalithic tombs. The dead were provided with those tools and weapons they might need in afterlife. Meanwhile, man worked at improving his axe heads and other tools. No longer were they crude and rough. Now, with growing skill, he polished them smooth. Around 1500 BC, traders from Central Europe brought axe heads made not of stone, but of a man-made alloy, a metal called bronze. The flint craftsmen worked hard to imitate the sharp bronze weapons. But the day of the flint weapon was fast coming to an end. And so, instead of the flint worker, there arose the metal maker, the maker of bronze. And thus the new Stone Age in Europe came to a close, and a new age, the age of bronze, came into being. For with the introduction of metal came other changes. Increased contact through trade with other lands and people lifted the horizon of man's world. He developed new ways of life, of doing things. With his new bronze axe, he could more easily clear large fields. Now, instead of the digging stick, he used the plow, making it possible to bring large areas of land under cultivation. The yield of his fields increased. And in the longhouse where he lived, life became easier. There was time now for an occasional game, which seems to have been very close to our own of checkers. As before, many families lived together, all members of the same clan. Together with their farm animals, they lived and worked in one large room. Here, however, was the greatest transformation brought by the introduction of bronze. For bronze brought power, new weapons to wage war. Against such weapons, the flint axe was of little avail. The ways of warfare were changed. Victory came to the men who bore weapons of bronze, as an increased population fought for the spoils that new lands could bring. As man's way of living and fighting changed, so too did the things in which he believed. The girl who went to pick berries now wore the emblem of a new god, the sun, the bringer of the crops, the giver of life. With his added leisure, man could mold the bronze into shapes that reflected the world as he saw it. A world that was ever expanding as trade with the regions to the south increased. About 500 years BC, man in northern Europe learned of a new metal, iron. From the bogs of Denmark came the pieces of iron ore which helped usher in a new age. More abundant, harder, and far cheaper than bronze, iron was a new source of power. The making of iron was a complicated process. First, charcoal had to be made, for no ordinary fire would be hot enough to melt the iron out of the ore. Next, the ore was crushed. Then both charcoal and powdered ore were mixed together. By the use of a bellows, a very hot fire was produced. When the iron was finally taken from the primitive furnace, it could then be forged into the shape desired. From the south had come knowledge of the wheel, and now a new plow was made possible, better than the old one, able to move faster. This one had a mold board which assured a deep furrow. Most important, from the south came the basis for a written language. The runic letters carved on this box belonged to a time that saw the beginning of written records, marking the end to the prehistoric age in northern Europe. The artifacts found in Denmark tell us much of the lives and ways of a people thousands of years ago. The drawings made in stone by the early hunters who went northward in pursuit of the reindeer. These tablets of stone, on which are carvings that tell of how the people of the north finally went out to sea in strong boats, on voyages of great adventure and conquest, all helping to tell the story of man in northern Europe as through the ages he moved to the threshold of civilization.